India. In one form or another, the word India has been used by many generations of Western people to describe a very vast and very wonderful Eastern country that it is curious to realize that in none of the 147 languages spoken by the inhabitants of that country is there any single word which means to any of them exactly what India means to all of us. In Sanskrit, the ancient literary language of the Indian Aryans, Sindhu was the name of the famous river which Alexander the Great crossed with his army in 326 BC and which in our geography books is called the Indus. And from that river we have borrowed a name for that tremendous empire, 1,766 square miles in extent, which stretches from the Pampas in the north to Cape Comorin and Colombo in the south. The navigators and explorers of the West were haunted by the idea of India about the time that Columbus and Cabot and Magellan were sailing strange and perilous seas. Many gallant ships perished in quest of the Northwest Passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and whenever a bold seafarer found himself on an unknown shore, he jumped to the conclusion that he had reached India, or some new halfway house to that golden empire. That is why the descendants of the ancient inhabitants of North America are, quite ridiculously, called Indians to this day. Everyone who knows modern India well agrees that to see the true colors and to breathe the true atmosphere of the country the traveler must leave the great, busy cities of the coast behind him and betake himself to the villages, where nothing has changed for hundreds of years. In cities like Calcutta and Bombay, East and West jostle and clash so queerly that the effect is almost bewildering. Bullock wagons creak across the tram lines, telegraph wires hum above mysterious, narrow houses of carved and painted teakwood with overhanging balconies and tiny grated windows, electric arc lamps throw their keen, blue glare upon the fretted niche where an image of an elephant-headed god sits in a fading necklace of marigolds. But in the country districts the riot, or cultivator, tills the soil just as his ancestors did before Alexander the Great crossed the Indus. Let us pay an imaginary visit to a typical village in Western India. The chief street, an irregular line of low, mud houses with thatched roofs, is full of noise and movement, though the greater part of the population is out working in the fields of corn and maize, or among the plots of pumpkins and melons and peppercanes that lie beyond. In the dry season of the year the fields and the houses are dusty and parched looking, but when the wet season comes, that time of the rains for which everyone waits so eagerly, everything is changed, and in some districts the very walls of the mud hut suddenly clothe themselves with small-petaled, pink begonias and tufts of maidenhair fern. At the door of his low-roofed dwelling squats the brazier, hammering away at a brass hotter or ceremonial wash-hand basin. Behind the houses 2 or 3 looms have been set up, the frames fixed between acacia trees. As the weavers draw their shuttles through the blue and crimson threads, showers of yellow blossoms descend upon them. Spinning is done with a wheel called a charka, turned by the hand instead of being worked with a treadle like the spinning wheel of the West. Indian nationalists are anxious that all Indians should resolve to wear garments spun upon the charka only, and never to use any fabric made with new-fangled machinery brought from other lands. Upon the veranda of the principal house in the village crouches a travelling jeweller, making silver rupees into trinkets for the headman's wife. There is to be a wedding in the village soon, and she wants a pair of new anklets in honour of the occasion. The Lohe is the blacksmith, but he does not stand under a spreading chestnut tree. His anvil is so low that he sits on the ground with 1 foot on either side of it, while he beats out a new iron pin for a wagon wheel. Watching him stands a lithe, half-naked, bronze-coloured fellow, with a tall bamboo pole in his hand. This is the Ma, a useful person who runs errands, guides strangers, and skins any of the village cattle that happen to die. He is an outcast, as are all those who handle hides and leather. In the distance you see a lean and tattered figure bearing a long, good-shaped drum and making his way toward the house where the jeweller sits. This is the Mang, and he has come because he has heard that there is to be a wedding, and he knows that a drummer will be needed to make music for the guests. On the outskirts of the village stands the holy pipal tree, of which the scientific name is Ficus religiosa. Under the shadow of its blue-green, heavy leaves, which never wither or turn yellow even in the driest season, sits the village priest, the Jost, with a scroll of queer-looking figures and calculations in his hand. This is an almanac, and he is making up his mind which date would be the luckiest for the wedding. Near the tank whence all the village women fetch water in big jars which they balance cleverly on their heads, the potter sits by his wheel, moulding the clay with deft touches from his half-closed hands. He has always plenty of work, because the little pots he makes for use as drinking vessels are never used twice, but as he only charges about a penny a dozen for them, he does not grow rich however industrious he may be. The Hindu religion forbids a man to drink twice from the same cup or to eat twice from the same platter, so these pots are broken after use, and leaves are often made to do duty for plates at meal time. The rest of the population of our village, including many of the women and children, is working in the fields. The younger workers help their mothers to weed, while their fathers drive the dingy white oxen that draw the plough. Some feet above the ground, between the trunks of two withered trees, a thatched shelter has been built, and there a watchman is posted, to scare birds, or jackals, or wandering thieves, away from the crops. Rice, millet and maize are the principal crops grown in the greater part of India, but pepper, sugarcane, tobacco, tea, cotton, indigo, hemp, melons, and betel-nut palms are cultivated in many districts. The soil is fertile when once it is well watered. Maize looks especially pretty growing, with its lofty green blades and its tufted plumes. Bull pepper is trained to climb up poles, as hops are in England, and there its shiny bright green pods dangle until they turn crimson. The tobacco plants have heart-shaped leaves, more than a foot across, but they do not attain any great height. The leaf intended for the manufacture of cigars is longer and narrower, and dries a darker shade of brown. A plantation of betelgeuse palms, Aveca catechu, is a most charming sight, especially in the dry season, when the fields are parched and bare. These palms are tall and slender, as tall as 40, or even 60, feet, and so slender that their average circumference is not more than 24 inches. The nuts are boiled, sliced, and dried in the sun. Sometimes the leaves also are pressed and dried. And then both nuts and leaves are used by Hindus much as chewing gum is used by Americans. In the houses of the rich, betel nut, wrapped in golden paper, is offered to guests upon silver trays, and it is considered exceedingly impolite to decline to take any. Even the poorest villager will probably have a pouchful concealed in the folds of his ahota. This dhoti is the chief, and very often the only, garment of the Hindu peasant. It consists of an ample loincloth of cotton, more or less white, which falls to the knees but leaves the upper part of the body bare. As 3 persons out of every 4 in India earn their living by cultivating the soil, it will be seen that the wearers of the dhoti are numerous, and that the prosperity of the whole Indian Empire really rests upon their industrious shoulders. This being so, it is a little curious that the Indian farmers seem to prefer old-fashioned, wearisome and disappointing methods of agriculture. For example, they often sow seed broadcast, instead of in furrows, and if a ryot wants to level a field, he lays a bamboo ladder on the ground, stands upon it, and makes 3 oxen drag him to and fro until the desired result is attained. Corn is threshed by a team of 3 oxen tethered to a post and driven round and round. The fate of the Indian crops depends upon the south-western monsoon, and whether the rainy months, which correspond to our summer, really are very rainy. If the rains fail, there is famine in the land, and great efforts are then made by the British authorities to relieve the distress of the people in the parched and hungry villages. Beyond the fields with which the Indian village is surrounded lies the jungle, that matted, mysterious forest where many fierce and beautiful creatures live, most of whom are the enemies of man. Deep in its tangled shadows are oozy pools where tigers come to drink, wild bees build their hives in its hollow trees, and there the brown bear comes, lumbering along on his hind legs, to seek for the thick, dusty, dark-colored wild honey. Monkeys swing and chatter overhead, leaping from branch to branch, or playing games among the heavy, juicy-stemmed creepers that droop from the trees. And sometimes, after dark, something that looks like a big dog with pointed ears pads softly along the outer fringes of the fields. But it isn't a dog, and if it draws near the clustering huts, the flicker of a woodcutter's fire is enough to send it scudding back into the forest. Everyone who has read the Jungle Books knows as much about Indian wolves as though he were an Indian wolf himself. By day the jungle is almost silent, but after sunset it is full of weird murmurings and moanings. Then the villagers sometimes find it necessary to cheer themselves up by banging drums and blowing upon conch shells. Many of the smaller children must be glad when the sun peeps over the green leaves of the pipal tree and wakes the village, and it is time for the whole family to make their ceremonial ablutions in the lota before the work of the day begins again. The village of which we have had a glimpse is a Hindu village. That is to say, the people worship the ancient gods of India, and, most probably, one or two quaint godlings of their own. You noticed that the farmers wore the dhoti, that the priest sat under the holy pipal tree, and that a brazen bowl was used for the ceremonies of morning worship. But if, instead of nobody wearing trousers, everybody, men and women, wore them, and if, instead of brass, the bowls and trays and lamps of the villagers were made of copper, you would know by these signs, as well as by others, that you were in the midst of a Mohammedan community. The religions of India are almost without number. Each district has its own legends, its own gods and devils, as well as the already numerous gods of the Hindu faith. But the Indian Mohammedans are faithful to the teaching of their prophet, who declared that there was no God but Allah, the one great creator, and who forbade them to adorn their places of worship with images of gods, or beasts, or men. The result is a very striking contrast between the Hindu temples and the mosques raised by the followers of Mohammed, the temples teeming with gods and goddesses, some of them fearful to behold, the mosques lonely and austere, but gorgeous with inlaid marble and glazed tiles. The ancient religion of India is called Brahmanism. The word Brahma means prayer, and from that word comes the name of one of the three principal divinities, Brahma. The other two are Shiva and Vishnu. Brahma is depicted as a red or gold-colored semi-human figure, with 3 or 4 heads and never less than 4 arms. His favorite mount is a swan. Vishnu is a personification of the sun. 9 times has he visited the earth, and he will return a 10th time in the form of a milk-white horse. The most powerful and the most popular of these 3 Hindu gods is Shiva. He is a fearful-looking fellow, with 5 heads, each head having 3 eyes. So far had his fame spread in Old Testament times that the prophet Amos uttered a warning, lest the Jews should be led astray and tempted to bow down before this strangest of strange gods. For Shiva is the tune whose tabernacle the Israelites are accused of carrying, in the 26th verse of the 5th chapter of the words of Amos. Vishnu's consort is a beautiful and kindly goddess, Lakshmi by name, the patroness of the city of Bombay, but Shiva's consort is a most alarming person, who rides on a tiger, and delights in blood offerings. Under the name of Kali, she is the godmother of Calcutta, and throughout eastern Bengal images of her are to be seen in the guise of a weird demon with long claws and bloodshot eyes. To these divinities, and to a vast army of others, great temples have been raised all over India. Some of these temples are now hollow ruins, where the monkeys scramble and chatter and the rock pythons have their lonely lairs. Others are still gorgeous with gold and incense, and the scene of almost hourly worship and sacrifice, to eyes accustomed to the pure and severe outlines of Greek temples, or the spires and domes of Western cathedrals. The holy buildings of Brahmanism seem curiously formless and confused. They have towers and terraces and colonnades, but all clogged with carving. Teeming throngs of sculptured beings, gods and demons, kings and elephants, hide the form of the temple and leave the eyes of the beholder weary. Yet they have a weird splendor of their own, these mighty fanes, and no traveler who has felt its spell can ever wholly forget it. One of the most important elements in the Brahmin religion is what is called the caste system. Under this system, people are divided into groups, according to their calling and that of their ancestors, each group being compelled to carry on changing traditions, and none being allowed to mingle with another. Outside these sharper divided groups are the luckless folk who have no caste at all, the untouchables. Those who have caste, the privileged Brahmin class, are naturally proud of it, and regard it as something to be very carefully preserved. They have to remember and to obey a most elaborate and, to us, bewildering set of rules, some of which may be broken by accident or quite unconsciously. If a Brahmin should be so unfortunate as to eat forbidden food, or be touched even by the shadow of an untouchable person, he at once loses caste, and to regain what he has lost he must undergo a severe process of purification, and pay a large sum of money to the priest of his temple. It may happen that a Brahmin is in charge of one of the wayside wells without which travellers upon Indian highroads would perish of thirst. To fellow Brahmins he is always ready to be helpful, but if an outcast approaches, and humbly craves permission to quench his thirst, the well-keeper takes a long bamboo pole and lets the water run down it, so that the shadow of the outcast shall not fall upon him, nor yet upon the well. If a Brahmin should be walking along a road and see an untouchable in the distance, he hastens to clap his hands loudly together, and the poor untouchables hastens to get out of his way, remaining hidden till the sacred person of the Brahmin is out of sight. To make it quite clear to every one that he sevens a Brahmin, and also to give fair warning to his less favoured countrymen to remove themselves from his path, every Hindu who has the right to do so wears an unmistakable caste mark, traced in white earth, charred sandalwood, red ochre, or ashes, in the centre of his forehead. Shiva worshippers trace this mark horizontally, Vishnu worshippers perpendicularly. The head is shaved, save for a topknot, concealed by the cap or turban. The costume of the Hindu women is exceedingly graceful, and, except that the more fortunate among them wear silken fabrics and many jewels, it is practically the same in all classes. Over a long, loose skirt they wear a sleeveless bodice. Over this again is draped the saz, a long strip of cotton or silk cloth, one half of which is wound round the waist, whence it hangs in folds to the feet, while the other half is brought up over the head and thrown across the left shoulder. When a Hindu lady of high degree is arrayed for some great festival, she tinkles and sparkles with jewels. You may imagine her, a slight and supple figure, her smooth dark hair parted on the brow and hanging in 3 knotted plaits behind. Her underskirt is of dull blue silk embroidered in silver, her sleeveless bodice is of green, thickly adorned with gold thread. On her ankles and her bare toes are clashing and clinking rings of silver and gold. In the centre of her forehead is a diamond ornament, from which fall on either side ropes of pearls and turquoise. Round her neck she wears no less than 4 necklaces, one of diamonds, one of pearls with an emerald pendant, one of diamonds and turquoise, and one of silver filigree. Her bracelets are so numerous that she herself might have some difficulty in counting them, but the ornament of which she is most proud is her nose ring, which is a thin hoop of gold about 4 inches in diameter enriched with a cluster of gems at one side. Over her head, and falling almost to her heels, is a veil of rose-coloured gauze with a heavy hem of gold. Underscore the dress of an Indian prince is surely one of the most picturesque and magnificent in the world, and, of course, the most magnificent item in it is the turban of finest silk shot through with golden threads, and crested by an osprey trembling with diamonds. The turban, in one form or another, is worn by both Hindus and Moslems, Mohammedans. Hindus arrange theirs in a great variety of odd ways, sometimes bunched on the top of the head, sometimes with a loop leaning to one side, sometimes with long ends dangling down. Among the Moslems the turban is more tightly wound, and covers the whole head, usually being crossed upon the forehead from right to left. Caps of many forms are worn, especially by Moslems. One of the most picturesque of these is the Ivan color, the Persian cap, of goat skin. The Parsis, the sun-worshipping community whose stronghold is in Bombay, wear embroidered caps Q24JS indoors, and outdoors a quaint kind OS for of high hat, something like the cocked by YSAIEE Napoleon, made of glazed, POV PRC of India chintz. Lurking here and there, in lonely forests and wild glens, there are queer, stunted, dark-skinned tribes, who wear neither turbans nor chintz hats, and whose favorite headdress is a pair of arrows with poisoned tips. These are the Bhils and Gonds, descendants of the primitive people who once possessed the whole of India, but who were subdued and driven to the east and north by the lighter-skinned Aryans who descended from the northwestern passes beyond the Indus in the very dawn of Indian history. Much can be learnt about these more civilized invaders from the Rig Veda, their national literature, an ancient and wonderful collection of songs and legends. There we see that about 1,400 years Book of Other Lands before Christ these Aryans had reached a pitch of civilization which made goldsmiths, barbers, and blacksmiths necessary. They fought from chariots, and quaffed a sort of beer made from a plant of the milkweed family called soma. Women were held in great honor among them, and some of the most beautiful hymns in the Rig Veda were composed by royal ladies of those far-off days. The first Mohammedan invasion of India took place in AD 664, only a little more than 30 years after the death of the Prophet, and again, in 977, a wave of Muslim conquerors surged eastward from Persia and Arabia. But it was not until the 16th century that Babur, the first of the great Moghuls, established himself at Agra, and founded a dynasty which reigned with amazing splendor for more than 200 years. One of the greatest of the Mughals was Babur's great-grandson, Akbar, who built for himself at Sikandra, near Agra, a tomb which is still one of the marvels of Asia, a vast palace of pale marble, with pillared cloisters and lace-like casements of fretted stone. Akbar means greatest, but on the carven sarcophagus above his tomb this proud prince caused to be inscribed not once, but many times, Allah Akbar, God is greatest, and Jalal Jalalahu, may his glory shine. From Persia these Muslim conquerors brought with them the art of gardening, and to this day many beautiful gardens remain which they planned and planted in India. One of these is the Nishot Bar, in Kashmir, with its foaming silver fountains and waterfalls, its vivid masses of asters and lilies, zinnias and roses, shaded by fluttering poplars and silver-barked china trees laden with dark shaggy leaf. Another art which these conquerors introduced into their new domains was the art of glazing tiles in gorgeous colors. With these tiles they encased their mosques and sepulchres, as may be seen at Multan, where the tomb of Yusuf Gades glitters with intense blue, inca blue and turquoise blue, upon a background of pure white. At the court of Akbar and his successors art was encouraged and artists were nobly rewarded. What is known as the Mughal school of painting produced many masterpieces on a small scale, exquisite miniatures, few more than a foot square, representing the monarchs, their pastimes, and their pets. Color and form are perfect, only perspective is lacking. From one of these pictures, we can get a very good idea of the personal appearance of these Persian princes, who were as splendid to behold as any hero of any fairy tale. Akbar's grandson, Shah Jahan, in particular, was an amazing fellow. You see him standing on the flowery turf in scarlet slippers gay with gold thread, close-fitting trousers of white and gold brocade, matching his tight, long-sleeved jacket. From his waist hangs a sort of petticoat, quaintly stiff and wide, of transparent gauze, upon which droop the ends of his fringed and embroidered sash. On his head is a curious, flat, purple turban, projecting a little behind, encircled with a string of pearls, and tipped with a jeweled plume. It is almost impossible to count the number of necklaces and bracelets he wears. The artist has painted them all most conscientiously, and you can see the blood-red glint of the rubies, the dazzling green of the emeralds, the pale shimmer of the pearls. And the center of all this magnificence is not a proud or haughty-looking personage, but a quiet, middle-aged gentleman with a longish nose, a small peaked beard, and thoughtful dark eyes. TK is Shah Jahan, to whom India owes the most beautiful and the most famous monument of Mughal art, the Taj Mahal, the garden tomb planned by him on the shores of the river Jumna, near Agra, as the last resting place of his dearly loved consort Arjuman Bonu, more often called Mumtaz Mahal, the crown of the palace. The approach to the Taj is through an archway of black and white inlaid marble, bearing an Arabic inscription inviting whosoever is pure of heart to enter into the gardens of paradise. Beyond you see a long canal, flanked by slender, dusky cypress trees, and, at the farther end, the Taj itself, with its great pearl-colored dome tipped by a golden iris flower, its airy minarets and its cluster of smaller domes seeming more like the baseless fabric of a vision than the work of human hands. Yet 20,000 craftsmen labored upon it for more than 20 years. The gardens which Shah Jahan planted round the tomb of the beautiful Mumtaz are still fair with 1,000 flowers. In spring they are covered by a mantle of streaked tulips, Madonna lilies, bluebells, daffodils, and the deep blue irises that were brought first from the hills of Kashmir. Mumtaz must have loved flowers well, for Shah Jahan ordained not only that the earth round the Taj should blossom forever in remembrance of her, but also that the tomb itself should be encircled by never-fading flowers whose petals are of sardonyx and turquoise, coral and lapis lazuli, jasper and other semi-precious stones. There, within screens of pearl-white marble so exquisitely carved that it seems like frozen lace, he sleeps his last sleep at the side of the beautiful Arjuman Bonu. Lovely though the Taj Mahal be, it is not purely or characteristically Indian. All Mughal architecture is influenced by Muslim ideas, by the dome and the minaret, and by the Muslim commandment, "Thou shalt make unto thyself no graven image." Very different are the temples of Benares, the sacred city of the Hindu faith, built upon a river, the Ganges, which in the eyes of 2 out of every 3 Indians is marvelously holy, and whose waters can bring salvation both to the living and the dead. Here pilgrims of all ages throng from all parts of India. Here pious people bring the bodies of their friends to be burned at the burning ghats on the brink of the Ganges and afterward committed to its purifying waves. Pilgrimages are timed according to the phases of the moon, and if there should be an eclipse of either the sun or the moon there is much excitement at Benares. The priests tell the people that a huge snake is trying to swallow the heavenly orb, and that only by many sacrifices and ceremonies can the peril be averted. When the eclipse passes, the people are much impressed by the power of their priests, and very grateful to them for exercising it to such good purpose. It must not be thought that all the Hindu priests willfully or knowingly deceive the simple folk. They themselves are nearly as simple. Many of them make long and weary journeys on foot, in order to look upon the holy river. A priest who has resolved to go on a pilgrimage to Benares often takes a vow of silence, and swears that no word shall pass his lips until he reaches his goal. He halts at every wayside shrine, and mutely implores the god whose image it contains to speed him on his way. Passers-by halt too, when they see that he has hung a wreath of marigolds round the neck of the god, and that he is preparing to burn a cake of cow dung in a little saucer before the shrine. When, with the aid of that very Western invention, a safety match, he has reduced the cake to ashes, he first smears his own forehead with it, and then the foreheads of any pious onlookers who beg him to do so. Whole families sometimes proceed to Benares together, camp out among seething crowds of fellow pilgrims on the bank of the river, and rise in the cool golden dawn to bathe in the river itself or in one of the walled pools which are regarded as almost more holy. The favorite is the earring pool, so called because the god Deva is said to have dropped his ear-ring into it one day, and its surface is always thickly filmed with petals from the garlands flung there by the faithful. Not all the pilgrims come on foot. Many make the journey by train, and thus again the East and the West are queerly brought together. The Western traveler realizes that he is truly in the East when his train stops at a country station and he sees a band of very tame and very well-nourished monkeys scrambling across the platform for the fragments of banana thrown to them by the passengers. When, either by the long dusty high road or the fearsome railway, the pilgrims reach Benares, they find themselves in a city of temples, vast, red-colored temples encrusted with carven gods and demons. In one dedicated to the fierce goddess Dugo, another name for Kali, thousands of monkeys make their home and graciously receive the offerings of the pious, while in another dwells a large family of peacocks, beautiful, honored, and holy. Outside, the main streets are flanked by rows of open stalls where you may buy the finest brass work, bowls, spoons, incense burners, and images of gods. Between these shining golden stalls flows an unending, many-colored stream of pilgrims, some carrying bundles of bedding, some carrying babies, others helping to bear a tottering elder toward the sacred Ganges. Very welcome is the arrival of the Bisti, pronounced beastie. The water seller, with his bulging skinful of Ganges water. The air is heavy with the scent of marigolds, for there is hardly a pilgrim, young or old, who has not a garland of these. By vivid yellow flowers round his shoulders. Myriad golds, too, are twined round the polished horns of the sleek white cows that come and go unafraid, and do not hesitate to snatch a mouthful from the green grocer's stall. They know, these sacred cows, that they will always have enough to eat, that they will never have to plow or thresh, or keep a water wheel turning all day, whatever may be the lot of their less fortunate relations in the fields beyond the city. For miles or so from Benares is a place called Sarnath, which to many millions of people outside India is a holier spot than any of the numberless mosques and temples of that amazing country. It was in the deer park at Sarnath that Buddha began to preach his new creed of unselfishness 600 years before Christ was born into the world. Kapilavastu, the place of his birth, where his father held sway as chieftain over the Saki clan, has long since been blotted out by the Nepalese jungle, but to more than 470 million of his faithful followers every place that was once associated with his stainless life and his gentle philosophy is sacred to this day. Kapilavastu is no more, and the bo tree at Sarnath, under which he sat to meditate and to teach, has withered, but the great grey mountains of Rajagriha, where he spent 5 years in solitary self-communion, and Kusanagara, where he died, are still holy ground. And there is in Ceylon an ancient tree, propped up by pillars, but still putting forth leaves every year, a tree which was planted as a cutting from Buddha's bo tree at Benares in the 3rd century BC. The word Buddhas means the enlightened one, but it was not the first name by which the great teacher was known. His family name was Gautama, and his personal name, by which his father and mother called him, was Siddhartha. Marvelous legends grew up about his birth and childhood. The earth, it was said, blossomed into 1,000 flowers to make a cradle for the newborn babe, and a stream of crystal clear water sprang from a dry rock to fill his first bath. An aged, saintly man, Asita by name, heard songs of joy among the clouds as he sat in meditation under the pipal tree, and knew that the spirit of heavenly wisdom had been born in human flesh, and went and knelt in worship before the child and his mother. When Siddhartha was only 8 years old, he astonished the learned man appointed to give him his first lessons in writing and counting, for when his tutor told him to take his tablet of sandalwood and trace upon it the words which he would dictate, the small boy proceeded to write them in 12 different languages. And when they came to arithmetic, he calmly reeled off all the various numerals with which the stars are numbered, land is measured, and mustard and barley are weighed. After this it is hardly surprising to hear that at the age of 18 he excelled all the suitors who were contending for the hand of the lovely Princess Yasodhara, drew a bow which none of them could even bend, shot an arrow so far that no eye could follow its flight, and cut through 2 talas. Trees with such a clean stroke of his sword that for a moment the trunk stood upright and his rivals thought he had failed. What is really interesting and curious about the beginnings of the faith which Buddha built up is that it was joy, and not sorrow, which led him to ponder upon the mysteries of life and death. Great grief has turned the thoughts of many men to these things, but young Siddhartha had known none but happy hours when he took the desperate resolve to give up everything that had made those hours happy, to leave his father, his bride, his baby son and his worldly riches, and go forth, with only his faithful charioteer, Channa, to bear him company, and lead a life of hardship and meditation among the 5 hills of Rajagriha. Thoughtful men, weary of the multitude of fantastic godlets worshipped by the mass of the people, had already sought enlightenment sometimes in lonely musing on those stern heights. But to none had it been given, and after a time Siddhartha decided that they and he were seeking it where it would never be found. He had to pass through many hours of intense discouragement and sadness before any ray of spiritual light fell upon him. Then, at last, as he sat under the green shadow of the bo tree, it suddenly seemed to him that he understood everything that had puzzled and saddened him before, and that he had found a path along which he could lead his people to a purer and more noble faith than the priests who served the fierce and foolish gods of the old religion could ever teach them. The chief lesson that Buddha learnt and taught was summed up 600 years after his death in the divine words, "Whosoever seeketh his life shall lose it," he saw, and he had the courage to say, that selfishness is the greatest of all evils, and the root of almost all the pain and sorrow in the world. Therefore, according to his religion, self must be subdued and blotted out, the soul must be dedicated to higher things, to right thoughts, right hopes, right speech, right efforts, and right deeds. Then, at last, it would have its reward in the absolute peace of nirvana, beyond the sounds and shadows of the visible world. Buddhism spread rapidly throughout Asia. The hearts of men were touched, as never before, by this strange, simple, kindly teaching. But the priests and the worshippers of the old fierce gods were filled with fury and alarm. And so it befell that by the 11th century of the Christian era the old gods were enjoying their own again, in the land where Buddha lived and died. 2 great forces combined to thrust Buddhism out of the land of its birth: the natural instinct of the ignorant people to cling to the childish beliefs, which they were better able to understand, and the successive invasions of Mohammedan conquerors from the northwest. At last the pure faith of Buddha was buried and hidden, like Kapila Vastu, from the eyes of men. The images of Gautama were overthrown, the golden shrines of Siva, the blood-stained altars of Kali, the glittering blue domes of the Moslems, rose from the earth that had once been trodden by his feet. But in other lands, lands that he never saw, lands, some of them, that he never heard of, China, Japan, Ceylon, Siberia, Tibet, the Malay Peninsula, and many islands of the East Indies, he is remembered and loved, and the way that he traced is humbly, and often imperfectly, followed. It survives in its purest form in Ceylon, the fragrant isle that hangs like a pearl on the brow of India. But there, as elsewhere, legends and ceremonies have gathered round Buddha which would greatly astonish him if he could return to earth. At Kandy, in Ceylon, for instance, there is a famous temple where pilgrims went to gaze upon the holy tooth, a tooth 1.5 inches long, which certainly never grew in any mortal jaw. In Tibet, they believe that Buddha does return to earth from time to time, in the person of the Dalai Lama, the head of all the Tibetan monasteries, a powerful and mysterious high priest whom the people reverence just as Roman Catholics reverence the Pope. Tibetan monks are called jamas, and their monasteries, or lamasseries, are perched on dizzy precipices among the highest mountains in the world. Until quite recently no Europeans had penetrated to their chief stronghold, Lhasa, and to go there is still one of the most perilous journeys that any stout-hearted traveller can undertake. High above the lamasseries tower the silver snows of the Himalayas. Far below, in narrow gorges shagged with junipers and pines, the foot of man falls so seldom that the deer and the other wild creatures are tame and trustful, and come regularly to be fed by the Buddhist hermits who have sought refuge there. At the doors of the lamasseries hang stuffed oxen, swaying in the wind. These are intended to scare away evil spirits, and it is for the same purpose that the lamas bang their great bronze gongs so often and so loudly during their devotions. But they are simple and courteous folk, deeply learned in the lore of their faith, and some of them can draw marvelous pictures on silk, with brushes and Chinese ink, showing the wheel of things, the whole circle of human life, and how the soul may escape from it into the infinite peace of nirvana. The gorgeous principalities on the Kashmir frontier were the first home of a game which most Indian princes play to this day, and which has become a favorite sport with many Western cavaliers, the game of polo. It is said that to see real polo you must go to India, where the game is faster and keener, and players and ponies are swifter and more skillful than anywhere else in the world. Another Indian sport which appeals strongly to the Western sportsman is pig sticking. And it sounds very exciting. The quarry is the lean, fierce grey boar, the only beast in the jungle of whom the tiger himself is afraid, and the horseman who pursues him, lance in hand, must have a quick eye, a powerful wrist, and nerves of iron, if he, and not the pig, is to win the day. Yet another Indian sport, and perhaps the most famous of all, is tiger shooting. Sometimes the tiger is shot from a makhan, a sort of platform, made of interwoven branches, high up in a tree, but it is considered better sport, more dangerous and more thrilling, to shoot from a howdah, on the back of a specially trained elephant that can be trusted, the wise beast, not to run away unless the tiger leaps straight onto his trunk. It was from the back of an elephant that King George shot the fine tiger that now glares at the beholder from a glass case in the Natural History Museum at South Kensington. The elephant has played a great part in Indian history from very early times. Ganesha, one of the lesser gods of the vast Hindu pantheon, is depicted with the head of one of these quaint and clever animals, and there are elephants carved in red sandstone, in teakwood, in ivory and in ebony, throughout the palaces and temples of India. A Raja's state elephant is a marvelous sight to see, with its wrinkled grey hide painted in bright colours, its howdah dangling with fringes of silver and gold, and its mahout, or driver, wearing his most magnificent turban and wielding an ankus, an elephant gourd, set with precious stones. Though elephants in their wild state are much less numerous nowadays than they were even 100 years ago in India, the dense forests of Assam and Travancore are still the homes of large herds of them. The method by which they are captured and tamed is both perilous and interesting. 2 large stockades are made, one many acres in extent and one a little less than an acre. When everything is ready, the wild elephants are rounded up and driven, quietly and gradually at first, into the outer stockade. Then, to the sound of foghorns, fireworks, and drums, they are stampeded into the smaller enclosure, which is called the keddah. Now comes the time when the native trappers and tamers are aided in their work by elephants already tame. These are called kumkis, or helpers, and they are uncannily intelligent. One kumki will come up on either side of a rebellious and bewildered captive, and jam him between them while their mahouts hobble him with ropes, and if the end of a rope falls, a supple trunk will slide down and seize it and give it back to the man who let it fall. When the newcomers have been made quiet by hunger, the kumkis take them down to the drinking pools. And at every stage in the education of the wild elephant his human tutors are ably assisted by tame members of his own tribe. So marvelous is the intelligence of the elephant, and so perfect the understanding between his mahout and himself, sometimes a whispered word, or the lightest touch of hand or heel, is enough to make the big beast understand what his driver wants him to do. Lord Frederick Hamilton relates in one of his books an amusing example of the quick response of an elephant to a hint from the mahout. This elephant was of the feminine gender, and her name was Chota Begum, little lady. She had the prettiest manners imaginable, and to the Englishman upon her back it seemed as if it must be the easiest thing in the world to guide such a gentle, obedient creature. So Lord Frederick began to think that he would very much like to try. Now there are few things that a mahout dislikes more than being asked to allow a white man to take his place on the elephant's neck, but Chota Begum's mahout dared not refuse. So Lord Frederick had his wish, or, at least, he very nearly had it. He fixed himself as securely as he could upon Chota Begum's neck, with his feet in the straw stirrups just behind her ears, and took the heavy ankus in one hand. The mahout and several of the mahout's friends watched from the shelter of the trees to see how the white man would fare. Before he slid down from his wonted perch, Chota Begum's mahout must have whispered a word of might into one of her big, flapping ears, for when, at last, her new rider succeeded in persuading her to start, she began to walk determinedly in a circle, round, and round, and round, and nothing that he could say or do would induce her either to come to a halt or to go straight on. Was this the gentle, obedient Chota Begum? As he found himself carried round in that seemingly never-ending circular march, Lord Frederick must have begun to wonder if it could really besh. And presently, from the green dusk of the trees, he caught a gurgle of suppressed laughter, which gradually swelled into a roar as Chota Begum continued to revolve. It is a sound that few white men have heard, for it takes a most extraordinary joke to stir a mahout to loud laughter, and he is usually regarded as a very serious and stately person indeed.